In this video, I will be talking about the very best argument for the existence of God, and it's called the Transcendental Argument for God, also known as TAG. And this is an argument I got from an online apologist named Jay Dyer. Jay Dyer got it from a guy named Greg Bahnsen, and Greg Bahnsen got it from a guy named Cornelius Van Til. And the typical issue with content about this argument is it's really abstract and obtuse, and it's kind of hard to understand. And so what I'll be doing in this video is I will be presenting this argument completely from memory, straight off the cuff, no notes, no outline, no preparation. And in doing that, I think the argument will be presented in a way that is accessible enough, because I'll be relying on my memory to give it, that it'll be really effective and really easy to understand. And the real crux of this argument is something called presuppositions. If you understand presuppositions and what presuppositions are, then you can understand the argument. So what is a presupposition? A presupposition is something that has to be true for something else to be true. So for me to be talking, it's true. It's presupposed that I'm breathing. If I'm not breathing, then I'm not talking. Likewise, if you're taking an advanced college course that has some prerequisites, some basic courses, some 101 or 102 classes, it can be presupposed that if someone is enrolled in an advanced course, that they've taken the prerequisites. And so the way this argument works is it says for things like logic, for things like time and space, for things like language to exist, we're presupposing the Christian God. There must be a God. And that is what I will be explaining throughout this video. And the thing that's so great about this argument is it is a very biblically sound and congruent argument. A lot of the problems with what most apologists say when they argue with atheists or when they argue with Islam, for example, is the apologist goes into the debate and he says, okay, I'm gonna use logic now to explain to you why the Christian God exists. And oftentimes, when your starting point is logic, when you say that I'm gonna use logic to prove this, you're presupposing that logic is true, but you're not assuming that the Christian God is real, because you're starting at logic. You're saying, okay, I'm going to use logic, and I'm going to start at logic, which I'm going to assume is certain. That's why you're using it. And I'm going to use it to now say some arguments and use some logical syllogisms to then reach to the conclusion that God exists. But you started with logic and you ended with God. That's backwards. Because in reality, we all start with God, and then logic comes afterwards. Because if you start with logic first, if logic is more certain to you than God, then your whole system as a Christian contradicts itself, because then logic itself becomes your God. So even if you might say, oh, I believe in God, but in your mind you believe logic is more real than God is, then you're always going to be in this tension. And the transcendental argument solves this tension. And the transcendental argument, it's extremely offensive. It thinks the best defense is an offense. And so it looks at all of these other competing worldviews: atheism, materialism, paganism, pantheism, Hinduism, Islam. And it says none of these other systems are congruent. They don't even make sense. They don't even make sense within their own paradigm. They contradict themselves. And so I'll be demonstrating this with what I think is the silliest one of these arguments, the silliest one of these worldviews, which is materialism, empiricism. And what this belief is, it's a very common belief in the West. It's the belief that for something to be real, you have to be able to see it or see its effects, taste it, touch it, smell it, any of the five senses. And so a materialist will believe that a rock is real. They will believe that this microphone is real because they can see it. So they think seeing is believing. But the problem with this perspective is that The materialist is using so many things in his life that he can't see, that he can't taste, that he can't touch, that he can't hear, that he can't smell in order to function. For example, language. I'm speaking words right now, and these words have meaning. Can we see that meaning? Can we smell that meaning? Can we touch that meaning? No, it exists outside of the material world. Another example is the scientific method itself. The scientific method requires logic to work. If you don't have logic, you can't do science. But you cannot use science, you cannot use the scientific method in order to prove logic, because logic is presupposed, it exists before science. It's immaterial. And so the scientist or the empiricist, he is using these completely immaterial things in day-to-day life, the meaning in his words, the logic or math, or even the concept of self. All of these abstracts, all of these universals, the materialist assumes, even as he makes a sentence, but he denies that they exist. So you can see that this worldview is completely contradictory. And the reason it's so contradictory is because universals are real. You know, sometimes people ask the question, is math something that's discovered, or is math something that's invented? And math is something that's discovered. It exists prior to its manifestation. For example, if you take the number 7, let's say I draw the number 7 on a whiteboard, and I erase it, the concept 7 itself, the universal of the number 7, did it disappear? No, 7 still exists even though I erase it off the whiteboard. It's not because I erase it off the whiteboard that it's gone from existence. No, the number 7 still exists as a universal. And so in this way, materialism completely breaks apart. It doesn't make sense. And so then from here you might say, okay, well, Andrew, that makes sense for materialism. But what about things like the other religions? And why can't you just have a situation where these universals exists? Math exists, logic exists, meaning exists, the concept of self exists. Why can't these things just exist without a God? Isn't it a non sequitur? Wouldn't it be a logical jump to go from, okay, well, universals exists, these math and logic and this, the concept of self exists, but how are you going to go from that to God? And that's a good question. Because let's say we put aside materialism. We're like, okay, that self-contradicts. The concept I'm explaining to you now, that these transcendentals or these universals can exist, a little guy named Plato also believed the same thing. But if these things exist without a God, you run into a lot of issues. Platonism has a lot of issues. For example, you have the third man argument. This one gets a little bit tricky, so stick with me here. If, let's say, okay, look. This is a water bottle, okay? Since Plato believed in universals that exist outside of the material realm, he would think that there is a concept called water bottle. Let's call it water bottleness. And every water bottle is a manifestation or an instance of water bottleness. But the problem with this belief is if we have a category that exists called water bottleness, and this water bottle exists, you would need a concept that includes both the concept of water bottleness and the water bottle. Let's call it water bottleness 2. This is a little abstract. If you don't completely understand this, that's okay. This will make sense though. And then you would have that new category. But then that category would have to entail the water bottle in the previous category, and then you have a third category. And then you have this infinite regression. If you don't understand it, that's fine. You'll still understand the totality of this argument, even if you don't understand infinite regression. So this Platonic concept of universals existing without a God doesn't make sense. And also, here's another really problematic issue with the belief that these universals can exist without a God. How do we go from the concept to the manifestation or to the instance? For example, let's take myself, okay? I am a human being. Therefore, if there must be a universal that exists that's called human beingness or human nature, and then I would be an instance or a manifestation of human nature. So would you. So would every other human. Every human that exists would have human nature. They would be an instantiation of humanness. But here's the issue. How do we go from the concept to the person? Plato doesn't know the answer to that. He can't answer that. He says, well, we were reincarnated. That's what it was. Before we all existed, we kind of existed in this realm of all of these categories and all of these forms. And then when we're born, we kind of remember what they were. But that reincarnation argument, it's obviously not a good argument. It's not an argument at all. He's just speculating. So this is the problem you run into now. It's called sometimes in philosophy the problem of the one and the many. And it is only through the Trinity that you can solve this problem. Now, how can that be? Let's take another religion, Islam, okay? Islam, they have a belief in one God, Allah. And they have a concept called tawhid, which means he is singular, which means there is no Trinity. Because us as Christians, we have the one Godhead and three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They don't like this three-person distinction. They say, no, we don't have any of that. It's just one God, Allah. And for them, Allah cannot have any distinctions. Because they believe this, they too suffer from the problem of the one and the many. This is also, follow me, this is why they really struggle with the concept of the incarnation. They're like, your God became human? Jesus Christ, God became human? How can that be? It's because they're so indoctrinated with this idea of tawhid, that God is this like indistinguishable, like he exists with no distinctions, with no persons. But this creates issues. Because if God is so distinctive, so separated from creation, like they believe, like completely separate, then there are things that exist on earth that cannot be explained with their system. I'll tell you what I mean. In Islam, Allah has attributes. They'll say Allah is all merciful. Allah is all knowing. Allah is all powerful. So on and so on. They have 99 of these. And they'll say that there is nothing that exists like Allah. It says this in their Quran. And so, if there's nothing that exists like Allah, and he's all powerful, all knowing, all merciful, then how can we as humans have any concept of power at all, or any concept of mercy at all, or any concept of, what was the third one I said? Knowingness at all? We wouldn't. He's so separated from creation. There's nothing in creation like him. Therefore, if he is powerful, how could we know any concept whatsoever of power at all? We wouldn't be able to. You see, this creates an issue for them. Also in the Quran, there is a story where Allah manifests himself on earth, and then it causes a mountain to shatter, if I recall correctly. But if God is so separate from earth, and there's no distinction at all, and he's so independent of creation, then how could he ever be able to manifest? It's the same problem that Plato had, the problem of the one and the many. How could the universal, the category, ever exist in a particular? How could the number 7 ever be demonstrated as 7 apples? How could the color red ever result in a red apple or a red curtain? How do we bridge this? Philosophy doesn't have the answer. How do we bridge this? Only the Trinity has the answer. Let's take the concept of love and apply it to Islam. If Allah was loving and Allah existed before creation, which for them he does, then who is there to love? How could he love if there is no recipient of that love? Self-love is just narcissism. I mean, if you're like one singular unity, there's no way, there's no object of the love, there's no subject for the love. But within the Trinity, there is love shared and exuded within the Godhead. The Father loves the Son loves the Spirit loves the Father, so on and so on. And God exists before creation in Christianity as well. And so he didn't have to change from not loving to loving. He was always loving because the persons in the Trinity loved each of the other persons before creation was manifested in space-time as we understand it. Muslims can't solve this. And because there's these three distinctions in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, these three persons, Jesus can manifest without God having to leave eternity and try to put his infinitude into earth. The Father, the Spirit, the divine essence can exist with an incarnation, with the Son, and there's still being one Godhead. So you see how it solves. I'm trying to be very careful with my words here because this is very particular theology. And so you can see how this solves the problem of the one and the many. You can see how now there is a manifestation that can occur without causing the Godhead itself to change, because God doesn't change. This can only exist with the Trinity. Love, the concept or the phenomena as we understand it of love, the finite amount of love that we as humans can comprehend can only have existed in its infinitude before creation if there was a Trinity. Do you understand? No other philosophical system can solve this dilemma of how any particular thing, like a human, can manifest from the abstract of human nature. You follow what I'm saying? And so if you look at any of these other ones, for example, let's say paganism, let's say Greek mythology, they don't have this problem solved of the one and the many. They don't have 3 in 1 because it's 3 in 1 that solves this problem. They have Zeus and Poseidon and whoever else, all of their gods. And so they don't have the issue, they don't have the concept of universals like Plato had. But as we demonstrated, you can't have material, you can't have particulars without a universal. And so for that reason, that can't exist. And someone might say, okay, well, what about something like pantheism or Hinduism, where they believe there is only singularity and particulars are just an illusion, because that's what they believe. In the Far Eastern philosophies, Hinduism is very pantheistic. It believes that everything is one, that particulars are an illusion. It is only the one universal that exists. We are all one, but we all think that we're separate. The issue with this belief is if everything is illusion, then the idea that everything is an illusion itself becomes an illusion. Again, it contradicts itself. And so you can see materialism, any concept of tawhid or a God without distinctions, the pagan gods, all of these human conceptualized ideas of God all fail one after another to give a comprehensive account for reality. It is only the Trinity which solves this tension between the many things that we experience and the universality from which they come. I will end with this. I mentioned some of the universals that exist outside of what is material, of what we can observe with our senses. Some of the examples I gave were logic itself, math, the concept of self, but there's also things like space-time or continuity in time. So, for example, when you wake up tomorrow, if you brush your teeth, which you should, when you squeeze the tub of toothpaste, before you squeeze it, you expect for there to be toothpaste that will come out of the tube. The reason why you expect that's going to happen is because you presuppose continuity in nature. You believe that since the last time I touched this tub of toothpaste last night, there was still toothpaste in it. When I wake up today and I squeeze that tub, toothpaste will come out. Now, this is not self-evident. You're supposing that. Because what if there was no continuity in nature? What if there was no continuity in space-time? What if there were no rules, is what I'm saying. Like, for example, gravity is a rule. What if that was just something that was constantly changing and it's a rule now, and then the next moment it's not a rule anymore? So you can see that this concept itself also is something that exists outside the material realm. The continuity of nature is a universal concept that exists outside of the material world. That's another one. So it's not just these universals on their own. Space-time, the concept of self, the concept of numbers or numbers themselves or logic itself. These things don't exist separately. You could see they're all woven in together. The way we experience reality has all of these things working in this symphonia, in this harmony. And have you ever, in your own life, seen these things been able to be kind of put together and understood outside of a mind? Only a mind. Even AI now. AI can't comprehend all these things. AI understands math. AI might be able to do some computations. It's still really computational in nature. But for it does not take all of these transcendence and consciousness itself and weave them all together in a way that's so natural for us that we don't even question it. Only a mind can do that. And so if all of these transcendentals exist outside of us, for example, if I do 1 + 1 = 2 in my head and I die, 1 + 1 = 2 lives on. It's not dependent on me. If we all die, if all of the humans on this earth are suddenly, they all disappear, 1 + 1 = 2 would still exist. So it's not dependent on our minds. But these things can only ever be woven together and understood in the context of mind. And so since they exist outside of us, all of us, and they could only be understood in a mind, then does that not demonstrate the existence of the divine mind? So, okay, this topic, I've been ranting about it now for over 20 minutes. I did my best to make it as understandable and simple as possible. If you still have questions, go ahead and leave a comment, and as long as the comment section doesn't blow up, I will try to get to your question. And we'll see you in the next one. Peace.